Eleanor Bennett's stomach tightened as she looked up at the grand stone building of Willowbrook Conservatory. The morning sun made the windows shine like gold, but to Eleanor they looked more like judging eyes. She clutched her worn leather folder of sheet music closer to her chest and took a deep breath. "You belong here just as much as anyone," she whispered to herself, repeating the words her father had told her that morning before she left their small apartment on the edge of town. The heavy wooden doors creaked as Eleanor pushed them open. Inside, the entrance hall buzzed with activity. Young musicians in expensive-looking outfits stood in small groups, some practicing finger movements, others chatting and laughing. Their confidence filled the space, making Eleanor feel even smaller in her simple blue dress, the one she had carefully ironed that morning. It was clean and neat, but clearly not designer-made like the clothes surrounding her. Eleanor approached the registration desk, where a woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose looked up with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Name, please?" the woman asked, pen hovering over a list. "Eleanor Bennett, for the piano scholarship audition." The woman's eyes flicked over Eleanor's appearance, lingering on her scuffed shoes and the loose thread hanging from her sleeve that Eleanor hadn't noticed. "Right, you're in Group C. Wait through there with the others. They'll call you when it's your turn." Eleanor nodded her thanks and headed toward the waiting area, a grand room with high ceilings and paintings of famous musicians on the walls. About 20 other hopefuls sat in chairs arranged in a semicircle. As she entered, several heads turned to look at her, and Eleanor felt the familiar weight of their stares. A girl with perfectly styled hair leaned toward her friend and whispered something. They both glanced at Eleanor and giggled behind manicured hands. Eleanor pretended not to notice as she found an empty chair near the back corner and sat down, placing her music folder neatly on her lap. "Where did she get that dress?" "A garage sale." The whisper was just loud enough for Eleanor to hear. More giggles followed. Eleanor kept her eyes down, focusing on her breathing the way she did when practicing a difficult piece. She had faced this kind of judgment before, at school, at her part-time job at the grocery store, even at the community center where she sometimes got to practice on their out-of-tune piano. People saw her plain looks and worn clothes and made their decisions about her worth before she ever opened her mouth. A tall, thin boy with a violin case nudged his friend. "Bet she's here for the cafeteria job." The comment sparked more snickers around the room. Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she kept her face calm. These people didn't know about the hours she spent practicing on paper keyboards when there was no real piano available. They didn't know about the calluses on her fingers or how she'd taught herself to read music using books from the library. They didn't know her at all. The door opened, and a stern-looking man in his 60s entered. Everyone immediately fell silent. His silver hair was combed perfectly, and his suit looked like it cost more than everything Eleanor owned. "I am Maestro Harrington," he announced, his voice filling the room without effort. "I'll be heading the judging panel today. We will proceed in alphabetical order within your groups." He glanced down at his clipboard. "Group A will start in 10 minutes in the main auditorium. Group B will be after lunch, and Group C late afternoon." His eyes swept across the room, pausing briefly on Eleanor. A small frown crossed his face before he continued. "This is the most prestigious scholarship we offer. We're looking for excellence, dedication, and the kind of talent that defines a generation." Eleanor's heart pounded. She had waited 3 years to be old enough to apply for this scholarship. 3 years of working odd jobs, of practicing whenever and wherever she could, of dreaming about this chance. As Maestro Harrington left, the room buzzed with conversation again. The Group A students gathered their things, some looking confident, others nervously reviewing their music one last time. A plump woman with kind eyes sat down next to Eleanor. "First time applying?" she asked. Eleanor nodded, grateful for the friendly face. "I'm Mrs. Chen, the piano teacher at East Side High. My student Lily is auditioning too." She nodded toward a nervous-looking girl warming up her fingers. "You look like you could use this more than she could." Mrs. Chen handed Eleanor a small bottle of water. "Staying hydrated helps with the nerves." "Thank you," Eleanor said, touched by the simple kindness. "Which piece are you playing?" Mrs. Chen asked. "I wrote my own, actually," Eleanor admitted quietly. Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose. "Original composition? That's brave. Most students stick to the classics to be safe." Before Eleanor could respond, a voice cut through their conversation. "Is she serious? An original piece?" It was the girl with the perfect hair, talking loudly to her friends but clearly meant for Eleanor to hear. Someone should tell her this isn't amateur hour at the community center. Mrs. Chen frowned, but Eleanor touched her arm gently. It's okay, she whispered. I'm used to it. The morning crawled by. Eleanor watched as Group A students were called one by one. Some returned looking relieved, others fighting back tears. Lunchtime came, and most students pulled out packed lunches or money for the cafeteria. Eleanor stayed in her seat, sipping the water Mrs. Chen had given her. She couldn't afford to waste money on lunch when the bus fare back home had already stretched her budget. The afternoon session began, and Group B students started their auditions. Eleanor used the time to close her eyes and run through her piece in her mind, her fingers moving slightly in her lap as she imagined the keys beneath them. Is she sleeping? How unprofessional, someone whispered nearby. Eleanor ignored them, staying in her musical world where nothing existed but the notes she had written, each one carrying a piece of her story. By late afternoon, Eleanor's nerves had settled into a strange calm. Group C was called to move to the audition hall waiting area. The grand auditorium had seats for about 300 people, though today only about 50 were filled, mostly teachers, parents, and local music patrons who came to spot new talent. Eleanor sat in the backstage area listening as names were called. Christopher Abernathy, Zoe Baker, Eleanor Bennett. A few snickers followed her name. Eleanor stood, smoothing her dress with slightly trembling hands. As she walked toward the stage, she heard whispers. That's the girl with the homemade piece. Look at her shoes. Does she even belong here? The stage lights were bright, momentarily blinding her as she stepped out. When her vision cleared, she saw the judging panel, 5 serious faces with Maestro Harrington in the center. His expression was already bored, his pen tapping impatiently on his notepad. Eleanor Bennett, he said, checking his list. You've chosen to perform an original composition? Yes, sir, Eleanor replied, her voice stronger than she expected. One of the judges leaned over to whisper something to Maestro Harrington, who gave a small, dismissive smile in return. Very well, he said with a sigh that clearly communicated his low expectations. You may begin when ready. Eleanor walked to the grand piano that stood in the center of the stage. It was newer and more beautiful than any she had ever played. She sat down on the bench, adjusting its height, feeling the smooth polish of the keys under her fingertips. She looked out at the audience and the judges. The perfect-haired girl and her friends had slipped into the back row to watch, smirking at each other. Some people were already looking at their phones, expecting nothing worth their attention. Eleanor closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw her father's face, tired from his night shift but still smiling with pride as she left that morning. She remembered the first time she'd touched a piano, how it felt like finding a piece of herself she hadn't known was missing. She thought of all the nights spent practicing while others her age were sleeping or having fun. The room fell silent as she sat motionless for several long seconds. Someone coughed. A judge shifted in his seat. Eleanor opened her eyes, looking not at the audience but at the piano before her. Her true friend. The one thing in her life that had never judged her by her appearance or background. She placed her hands on the keys, took a deep breath and began to play. What happened next would change everything. The first time Eleanor touched a piano, she was 7 years old. Her father, Thomas Bennett, worked as a janitor at the Westfield Music School. On evenings when babysitters fell through, he would bring Eleanor with him, setting her up with books and coloring pages in a corner while he mopped floors and emptied trash cans. Stay put, Ellie, he'd say with a gentle smile. And remember, don't touch anything, she'd finish for him, knowing the rules by heart. For weeks she obeyed. But then came the night when her father was cleaning the bathrooms on the other side of the building. Eleanor had finished her coloring book and wandered down the empty hallway, drawn by curiosity and the faint memory of music she'd heard earlier that day when students were practicing. The door to Studio 3 stood slightly ajar. Inside, moonlight spilled through tall windows, illuminating a grand piano. It looked like a sleeping giant to her young eyes. Without thinking, Eleanor slipped inside and approached it cautiously as if it might wake up and scold her. Her small fingers hovered over the keys. She pressed one down gently, surprised by how easily it moved. The note rang out clear and perfect. Eleanor pressed another key, then another. Something stirred inside her chest, a feeling she couldn't name but would later recognize as belonging. That night she played until her father found her. Instead of anger, his face showed wonder. "Ellie," he whispered, "how did you know how to do that?" Eleanor shrugged. "I didn't, the piano showed me." The next day, Thomas Bennett did something brave. He approached Ms. Olivia Reed, the owner of the music school, and told her about what he'd seen. "My Eleanor, she's never had a lesson, never even touched a piano before last night. But she was playing like she was born knowing how." Ms. Reed was skeptical, but agreed to listen to Eleanor play after classes ended the following evening. When the 7-year-old sat at the piano and began playing by ear a song she'd heard on the radio that morning, Ms. Reed's doubt turned to amazement. "She has a gift," Ms. Reed told Thomas. "A rare natural talent. But lessons at Westfield cost money the Bennetts didn't have." Thomas worked 3 jobs just to keep their tiny apartment and put food on the table. Eleanor's mother had left years ago, unable to handle the hardships of their life, leaving Thomas to raise their daughter alone. Ms. Reed offered a solution. "Let her come after hours. She can practice when the school is empty, and I'll give her materials to study. In return, perhaps she could help you with some of the cleaning." And so began Eleanor's unusual music education. 3 evenings a week, she would help her father clean the music school. When they finished, she would get 1 precious hour at the piano while he sat nearby, resting his tired feet and beaming with pride. Ms. Reed left theory books and sheet music for Eleanor to study. On nights when she couldn't go to the school, Eleanor practiced on a paper keyboard she had drawn carefully on cardboard, her fingers moving silently over the fake keys while she heard the music in her head. By 10 years old, Eleanor could play pieces that challenged the school's advanced teenage students. But as her talent grew, so did the challenges in her life. Thomas Bennett's cough started as nothing serious, just a tickle in his throat that wouldn't go away. By the time they discovered it was something far worse, the disease had spread through his lungs. Medical bills piled up alongside past-due rent notices. Eleanor was 12 when she got her first paying job, washing dishes at a local diner on weekend mornings. Her father protested, but she was stubborn. "You've taken care of me my whole life, Dad," she told him. "Let me help now." With her father too sick to work regularly, Eleanor took on more responsibilities. She learned to cook simple meals, to budget their limited money, to negotiate with landlords for more time. School days were for learning and nights for caring for her father. The hours at the piano became fewer, sometimes disappearing entirely for weeks at a time, Ms. Reed noticed. "Your playing has changed," she told Eleanor one rare evening when the girl managed to practice. "There's more depth to it now, more feeling." Eleanor nodded, her fingers continuing to move across the keys. "I used to play notes," she said quietly. "Now I play life." At 14, Eleanor faced a crossroads. Her father's medical treatments were failing, and their financial situation was desperate. The hospital social worker suggested a state facility where Thomas could receive care. "You could enter foster care," the woman said gently to Eleanor. "It would just be temporary until your father recovers." But Eleanor knew what temporary meant in situations like theirs. She'd seen other families broken apart by circumstances, the pieces never fitting back together the same way. That night, she snuck into the music school long after closing. Ms. Reed had given her a key years ago, trusting her completely. Eleanor sat at the piano in the darkened recital hall and played for hours, pouring all her fear and determination into the music. By morning, she had made her decision and composed her first complete piece. She approached Ms. Reed with a proposal. "I want to teach beginners. Young kids. I know I'm young too, but I can do it. I'll clean twice as much and you won't have to pay me much." Ms. Reed studied the thin, serious girl standing before her. "This is about your father's care, isn't it?" Eleanor nodded. "We need to stay together. He's all I have." Against her better judgment, Ms. Reed agreed. And so 14-year-old Eleanor began teaching piano to children as young as 5, showing a patience and understanding that belied her years. The parents never questioned her age. Her talent and gentle teaching methods spoke for themselves. For 3 years, Eleanor balanced school, teaching, caring for her father, and her own practice. She slept little, laughed less, but never complained. The piano became her confidant, the only place where she could express everything she couldn't say aloud. Her father's condition stabilized but never improved. On good days, he would sit in their small living room and listen to Eleanor play on an old, upright piano, a surprise gift from Ms. Reed, and the other teachers who had come to respect the determined young woman. "You should be Playing in concert halls, Thomas would tell her. Not stuck here with me, Eleanor would shake her head. Music isn't about where you play, Dad. It's about what you say with it. At 17, Eleanor heard about the Willowbrook Conservatory Scholarship. It was a full ride, tuition, housing, even a small stipend. It could change everything. You have to try, Ms. Reed insisted, helping Eleanor with the application. Your talent deserves this chance. The night before the audition, Eleanor sat beside her father's bed. Thomas was having a bad day. His breathing labored even with the oxygen tank. I'm scared, Dad, she admitted, holding his thin hand. What if they don't like my piece? What if they don't like me? Thomas squeezed her hand weakly. Play for me, he whispered. And so in their tiny apartment, with the sounds of traffic and neighbors' arguments filtering through thin walls, Eleanor played her audition piece on their old upright piano. She played the composition she had written over the past 3 years, a piece that told the story of her life with her father, their struggles and small victories, their unbreakable bond. When she finished, she looked up to find tears streaming down her father's face. They might not like you at first, Ellie, he said, his voice raspy. People like them rarely do. But when you play like that, they'll have no choice but to hear you. And once they truly hear you, they'll see you too. The next morning, Eleanor ironed her simple blue dress, the nicest thing she owned. She made her father breakfast, gave him his medication, and called their neighbor, Mrs. Patel, to check in on him during the day. You belong there just as much as anyone, Thomas told her as she left. Remember that. As Eleanor now sat at the grand piano on the Willowbrook stage, her father's words echoed in her mind. The judging panel watched with bored expressions. The audience whispered. The weight of 17 years of struggle and perseverance rested on her shoulders. She took a deep breath and placed her fingers on the keys, ready to tell her story the only way she truly knew how. Time seemed to slow down in the auditorium. Eleanor sat at the piano, aware of every eye on her. The grand piano gleamed under the stage lights, its polished surface reflecting the skeptical faces in the front row. Someone coughed. A chair creaked. A pen tapped impatiently against a clipboard. Eleanor's hands hovered above the keys, not yet touching them. For a moment, doubt crept in like a cold draft. The other students who had auditioned came from proper musical backgrounds. They had expensive teachers, years of formal training, and parents who drove them to competitions in fancy cars. All Eleanor had was a borrowed hour at a music school after closing time, and a second-hand upright piano with 3 slightly out-of-tune keys. From the corner of her eye, she could see Maestro Harrington leaning over to whisper something to the woman judge beside him. The woman's eyebrows rose, and she gave a small, dismissive nod. Eleanor couldn't hear what they said, but their expressions told her everything she needed to know. They had already decided about her. It was the same look she'd seen countless times before, from the principal at school when she had to explain why her homework was sometimes late, from the parents of other children who didn't want their kids playing with the janitor's daughter, from the nurse at the hospital who suggested that perhaps her father would be better off in a state facility. Eleanor closed her eyes, blocking out everything but the feeling of the bench beneath her and the silent keys waiting for her touch. The seconds stretched longer. In the audience, people began to shift uncomfortably. Is she okay? Someone whispered loudly enough for Eleanor to hear. Stage fright, poor thing, another voice replied, not unkindly but dripping with pity. I told you she doesn't belong here, came a third voice, sharp with satisfaction. Maestro Harrington cleared his throat pointedly. Miss Bennett, we have many auditions to get through today. If you're not ready, Eleanor didn't open her eyes. Instead, she let the sounds of the room fade until all she could hear was her own heartbeat and the ghost of her father's voice. Once they truly hear you, they'll see you too. In her mind, she wasn't sitting in the grand auditorium of Willowbrook Conservatory. She was back in their small apartment, playing for her father on nights when his pain was too great for sleep to find him. She was in Studio 3 at Westfield Music School, practicing in the early morning hours before the first students arrived. She was sitting on their fire escape on summer evenings, humming melodies to the city below while the sun set between tall buildings. Eleanor's mind traveled to all the moments that had shaped her piece. The day she'd gotten her first paying piano student, a shy 6-year-old boy whose mother paid in home-baked bread sometimes when money was tight. The night her father had been rushed to the hospital, leaving her alone and terrified. The afternoon Ms. Reed had surprised her with the used upright piano, delivered by 4 sweating men who barely managed to fit it through their apartment door. Each memory added a layer to the music that lived inside her. Each struggle and small joy had become a note, a phrase, a movement in the piece she was about to play. This wasn't just an audition piece, it was her life story translated into music. "Miss Bennett," Maestro Harrington's voice was sharper now. "If you cannot perform," Eleanor opened her eyes. She didn't look at the judges or the audience. She looked at her hands, strong hands with short nails and calluses from years of playing and working. Hands that had washed dishes and administered medicine. Hands that had turned pages of borrowed music books and held her father when he cried from pain. These hands had a story to tell. As the tension in the room reached its peak, Eleanor remained completely still. The contrast between her calm exterior and the restlessness of the audience created a strange energy in the auditorium. A few people had begun gathering their things, assuming the audition was over before it had begun. Maestro Harrington sighed loudly and made a note on his paper. "I think we've seen enough." Eleanor's fingers finally touched the keys. The first chord rang out, soft but clear, like a question hanging in the air. It was followed by a second, then a third, each building on the last, creating a conversation between her hands. The simple melody that emerged was deceptively uncomplicated, the kind that sounds like it's always existed, waiting to be discovered rather than created. The whispering in the audience stopped. Maestro Harrington's pen paused mid-stroke. The girl with the perfect hair who had mocked Eleanor earlier leaned forward slightly in her seat. Eleanor's right hand began a gentle rolling pattern while her left added depth with resonant bass notes. The piece began to evolve, growing from its humble beginning into something more complex. Like her life, it didn't follow expected patterns. It changed time signatures when traditional music theory said it shouldn't. It blended classical structures with hints of folk melodies she'd heard street musicians play. It borrowed from lullabies her father had sung to her, and transformed them into something both familiar and entirely new. As she played, Eleanor's shoulders relaxed. Her back straightened. The nervousness that had paralyzed her moments ago transformed into a quiet confidence. This was the one place in the world where she knew exactly what she was doing. 3 minutes into her piece, she reached the part that represented the day her mother left. The music turned somber, with hollow spaces between notes that spoke of absence. A tear slipped down Eleanor's cheek, but her fingers never faltered. She had played through tears many times before. In the third row, an older man with silver hair pulled a handkerchief from his pocket. On stage, Eleanor was unaware of him or anyone else now. She had entered that rare space where the musician and the music become inseparable. The piece moved into its middle section, faster, more urgent. This was the struggle of recent years, the fear of losing her father, the scramble to keep their small world from falling apart. Her fingers flew across the keys, sometimes crossing over each other in techniques she had taught herself from watching videos at the public library. A few of the more technically minded judges leaned forward, surprised by the complexity coming from the plain girl they had dismissed. Mrs. Chen, the kind piano teacher who had given Eleanor water in the waiting room, watched with wide eyes. She had taught for 30 years and could recognize when someone was playing from a place beyond mere skill or practice. This was music as language, as breath, as life itself. The auditorium had fallen completely silent except for Eleanor's playing. Even the usual shuffling, throat clearing, and program rustling had stopped. It was as if everyone in the room was collectively holding their breath. One of the judges reached for his water glass but stopped mid-motion, unwilling to create even that small disturbance. Another had closed her eyes, her head swaying slightly with the music. Maestro Harrington sat completely still, his expression unreadable but his eyes never leaving Eleanor's hands. In the back row, 2 latecomers slipped in quietly, a renowned violinist who had been giving a master class in another part of the building and his assistant. They had heard rumors of an unusual audition taking place and had come to see for themselves. Now they stood against the wall, the violinist's fingers unconsciously moving at his side as if playing along with Eleanor. 7 minutes had passed, though no one was checking the time. Eleanor's piece moved into a section that spoke of small joys, teaching her first students, the community that had formed around her and her father, the moments of peace found even in hardship. The melody became lighter here, dancing above steady chords that provided foundation and context. And then, as the piece approached its final movement, Eleanor did something unexpected. She paused, a full 2 beats of complete silence. In that momentary void, the entire auditorium seemed to catch its collective breath. What followed was the heart of her composition, the section she had written about her father. It began simply with a melody so tender it made the air itself seem fragile. Several people in the audience pressed their hands to their mouths. The woman judge who had nodded dismissively earlier was now perfectly still, her clipboard forgotten in her lap. As this final section built, Eleanor's whole body became part of the performance. She was no longer the hunched, nervous girl who had walked onto the stage. She moved with the music, her face expressing every emotion that flowed through her playing. In this moment, no one saw her worn dress or her simple hairstyle. They saw only her complete transformation through music. The piece began its conclusion, returning to themes from the beginning but transformed by the journey, just as Eleanor herself had been transformed by her experiences. The final notes hung in the air like a question and an answer at once, an acknowledgement of struggle and a quiet declaration of hope. As the last note faded, Eleanor's hands remained on the keys. For several seconds, not a sound could be heard in the auditorium. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire room was suspended in the moment between the end of her music and the return to reality. Eleanor finally lifted her hands from the piano and placed them in her lap. She kept her eyes down, suddenly aware again of where she was and what was at stake. The silence stretched on, becoming almost unbearable. Had they hated it? Had her risk failed? Would they laugh now that it was over? She gathered her courage and looked up at the judge's table. What she saw there would change everything. Eleanor looked up at the judge's table. 5 faces stared back at her, transformed from their earlier expressions of boredom and dismissal. Maestro Harrington's mouth hung slightly open, his pen forgotten in his limp hand. The woman beside him had tears streaming unchecked down her cheeks, leaving trails in her carefully applied makeup. The youngest judge, a renowned pianist himself, was staring at Eleanor's hands as if seeing something extraordinary and impossible. For 3 heartbeats more, the silence held. Then, from somewhere in the back of the auditorium, a single person began to clap. The sound broke the spell, and suddenly the room erupted. People rose to their feet, applause thundering through the space. Someone shouted, "Bravo!" and others joined in with calls of appreciation. Eleanor blinked, confused by the response. She had played her piece, the music that lived in her heart, but she had never imagined it would affect others this way. She had been playing for herself, for her father, for the journey they had taken together. She hadn't considered how it might sound to people who hadn't lived it. From her seat at the piano, she saw the renowned violinist in the back, clapping with unrestrained enthusiasm. The girl with the perfect hair who had mocked her earlier was standing too, her face showing a complex mix of emotions: surprise, respect, and perhaps a touch of shame. Mrs. Chen, the kind piano teacher, was beaming through her tears and nodding as if to say, "I knew it." Even the stern-faced registration desk woman had slipped into the auditorium and stood by the door, her clipboard clutched to her chest, looking stunned. Eleanor didn't know what to do. No one had prepared her for this. She had expected to play, receive polite, lukewarm feedback, and leave with her hopes of a scholarship dashed but her dignity intact. This response, this overwhelming wave of appreciation, was entirely outside her experience. She stood shakily and gave an awkward bow, the way she had seen performers do in videos. This prompted another round of applause. When she straightened, she saw Maestro Harrington rising from his seat, still looking somewhat dazed. He approached the piano, moving as if in a dream. When he reached Eleanor, he extended his hand. She took it hesitantly, noting how soft his palm was compared to her calloused fingers. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice carrying in the now hushed auditorium. "In my 47 years of teaching and judging musical performances, I have rarely, perhaps never, been so moved by an original composition." He paused, seeming to struggle with words, which Eleanor suspected was unusual for him. "May I ask what you titled this remarkable piece?" Eleanor swallowed. "It's called Home," she said softly, "because that's what music has always been for me, the place where I truly belong." Maestro Harrington nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something for him. Indeed, he said. You certainly belong in music, Miss Bennett. And if I have anything to say about it, you will find a home here at Willowbrook. A murmur ran through the audience. Everyone knew what his words implied. The judging process was supposed to take days, with deliberations and debates among the panel. No decisions were announced until all auditions were complete. Yet here was Maestro Harrington all but declaring Eleanor the winner on the spot. The woman judge approached, dabbing at her eyes. That was extraordinary, she said. The technical aspects alone would qualify you for consideration, but the emotional depth... She shook her head, unable to finish. Where did you study? Asked the youngest judge, joining them. Your technique is unusual, innovative even. Some of those transitions shouldn't work theoretically, but they do, brilliantly. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush. I didn't really study anywhere officially, she admitted. Ms. Reed at Westfield Music School let me use the pianos after hours, and I read whatever books I could find. I watched videos at the library, and I just played whenever I could. The judges exchanged glances of disbelief. Self-taught, the young judge said. That's why it's so pure, interrupted the third judge, an older man with kind eyes. No one told her what couldn't be done, so she did it anyway. The violinist from the back of the room had made his way to the stage. People moved aside respectfully as he approached. Everyone in the music world knew Anton Petrovich, whose recordings had won every major award and whose concerts sold out within minutes. Young lady, he said, his accent reflecting his Russian origins, you have gift that cannot be taught. Technique, theory, these things, yes, we teach. But to speak through music as you just did? He tapped his chest. This comes from here. This is rare, Eleanor felt overwhelmed. These were people whose names she had read in articles, whose recordings she had listened to on the public library's computers, whose careers represented everything she had dreamed of, but never believed possible for herself. Thank you, she managed to say, but I really just played what I felt. That, said Maestro Harrington, is precisely the point. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Eleanor was asked to stay after the other auditions concluded. She sat in a small office with the 5 judges, answering questions about her background, her training or lack thereof, and her father's condition. She told them everything honestly, too dazed to even consider that her humble origins might count against her. Your father, the woman judge said gently. You mentioned he's ill? Eleanor nodded. Lung disease. He can't work anymore. That's why the scholarship would mean so much. I wouldn't have to worry about rent and could focus on my studies while still having time to care for him. The judges exchanged looks again, some unspoken communication passing between them. Miss Bennett, Maestro Harrington said, leaning forward in his chair. What you played today wasn't just impressive, it was important. You have a voice, a musical perspective that deserves to be developed. Willowbrook would be privileged to be part of that development. Eleanor's heart began to race. Was he saying what she thought he was saying? We would like to offer you the full scholarship, he continued. Tuition, housing, meals, and a stipend. Additionally, he glanced at his colleagues who nodded encouragingly. We would like to make special arrangements for your father. My father? Eleanor echoed, confused. The kind-eyed judge explained. Willowbrook owns several faculty apartments near campus. One is currently vacant. We would like to offer it to you and your father at no cost for the duration of your studies. It's on the ground floor and has wheelchair access should that become necessary. Eleanor stared at them, unable to process what she was hearing. But why would you do that? Anton Petrovich, who had joined the meeting, spoke up. Because talent like yours appears perhaps once in a generation. It would be a crime against music itself to let circumstances prevent its development. There's more, Maestro Harrington said. Mr. Petrovich has expressed interest in becoming your personal mentor. This is unprecedented. The violinist smiled at Eleanor's shocked expression. I heard truth in your playing. I want to help you share that truth with the world. Eleanor felt tears welling up. This was beyond anything she had dared to hope for. A scholarship alone would have been a miracle. But housing for her father? A mentor of Anton Petrovich's caliber? It seemed impossible. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say yes, the woman judge urged, smiling now. Say you'll bring your music to Willowbrook. Eleanor thought of her father, of how his face would light up when she told him. She thought of the tiny apartment they would leave behind, The struggle to pay bills, the constant worry. She thought of the hours she could now dedicate to music without exhaustion pulling at her. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger. "Yes, thank you." "I can't believe this is happening." "Believe it," Maestro Harrington said, extending his hand again. "Welcome to Willowbrook, Miss Bennett." As they walked out of the office, Eleanor noticed the group of students who had mocked her earlier standing in the hallway. They had clearly been waiting to see the outcome. Their faces showed varying degrees of surprise and chagrin as they watched her emerge with Anton Petrovich's hand resting lightly on her shoulder, a clear sign of his approval. The girl with the perfect hair stepped forward hesitantly. "Your piece was amazing," she said, looking uncomfortable but sincere. "I've never heard anything like it." "Thank you," Eleanor replied simply. She felt no triumph or vindication, only a strange peace. Their mockery seemed distant now, belonging to a different world than the one she suddenly found herself in. As she gathered her things to leave, Mrs. Chen approached and hugged her impulsively. "You showed them who you really are," she whispered. "You made them see past the surface." "I didn't think about showing them anything," Eleanor admitted. "I just played my truth." "That," Mrs. Chen said with a smile, "is exactly why it worked." Outside the conservatory, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street. Eleanor stood on the steps, breathing deeply. The world looked different somehow, brighter, full of possibilities she had never allowed herself to imagine. She had entered the building that morning as the janitor's daughter, the girl who practiced on a paper keyboard, the student who wasn't supposed to belong. She was leaving as something else entirely, a musician whose voice demanded to be heard. Eleanor thought of her father waiting at home, probably watching the clock anxiously. She couldn't wait to tell him everything. But first she had one more thing to do. She walked to the nearest payphone, fed in her coins, and dialed Ms. Reed at the Westfield Music School. The woman who had first recognized her talent deserved to know what had happened. As the phone rang, Eleanor watched the people passing by on the street, hurrying home from work, going about their lives, each carrying their own untold stories. She wondered how many of them, like her, had gifts hidden beneath ordinary exteriors, waiting for the chance to be revealed. The line connected, and Ms. Reed's familiar voice answered. "Ms. Reed?" Eleanor said, her voice breaking with emotion. "It's Eleanor. I have something to tell you." The apartment building where Eleanor and her father lived stood in sharp contrast to the grand stone edifice of Willowbrook Conservatory. Paint peeled from the fire escapes, a flickering streetlight cast uncertain shadows across the cracked sidewalk. The elevator had been out of order for months, so Eleanor climbed the 4 flights of stairs, her footsteps echoing in the stairwell. Despite her exhaustion, she took the steps 2 at a time. Her body felt lighter than it had in years, buoyed by what had happened at the audition. She couldn't wait to see her father's face when she told him. Outside their apartment door, Eleanor paused to catch her breath. She could hear the television playing softly inside, one of the nature documentaries her father loved to watch. For a moment, she simply stood there, savoring the knowledge that their lives were about to change. Then she turned her key in the lock and pushed the door open. "Dad, I'm home." Thomas Bennett sat in his worn armchair by the window, oxygen tubes running to his nose, a thin blanket covering his legs despite the warmth of the evening. At the sound of Eleanor's voice, he muted the television and turned toward her, his eyes immediately searching her face for clues about how the audition had gone. "Ellie," he said, his voice raspy but warm, "I've been waiting all day." Eleanor dropped her bag by the door and crossed the small living room to kneel beside his chair. Up close, she could see how much the day had taxed him. The shadows under his eyes, the slightly blue tinge to his lips that appeared when his oxygen levels dipped. He had clearly been fighting to stay awake until she returned. "So?" he prompted, when she didn't immediately speak. "How did it go?" Eleanor opened her mouth but suddenly found that words felt inadequate. How could she possibly convey everything that had happened? How could she explain that in the space of a single afternoon, all the barriers that had seemed insurmountable had crumbled away? Instead of answering, she took his thin hand in both of hers and pressed it to her cheek. Then she began to cry. Not the quiet, controlled tears she had trained herself to shed over the years, but deep, shuddering sobs of relief and joy and disbelief. "Ellie?" Alarm filled her father's voice.
What happened?
"Did something go wrong?" She shook her head vigorously, still unable to speak. Thomas stroked her hair with his free hand, his touch gentle as it had always been from her earliest memories. "Take your time," he said. "I'm here." Finally, Eleanor managed to collect herself enough to look up at him. "Dad," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "They loved it. They loved my piece." Hope flickered across Thomas's face, but he was cautious. Life had taught them both not to expect too much. "That's wonderful, Ellie. I knew they would." "No, you don't understand," Eleanor said, a laugh bubbling through her tears. "They didn't just like it. They're giving me the scholarship." "The full scholarship." Thomas's eyes widened. "The full, all of it?" "Tuition and housing and all of it," Eleanor confirmed, squeezing his hand. "But that's not even the most amazing part." She took a deep breath. "They're offering us an apartment near the school. Ground floor, wheelchair accessible if you need it. No rent. No cost at all. We can live there together while I study." Thomas stared at her, disbelief written across his features. "That's not possible." "Why would they?" "Because of how I played," Eleanor said simply. "They said my music deserved to be developed, that it was important. And the famous violinist Anton Petrovich, he was there, Dad. He wants to be my mentor, my mentor. Can you believe it?" Thomas's eyes filled with tears. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes, I can believe it. I've always known how special your music is." He lifted a shaking hand to touch her cheek. "I've always known how special you are." Eleanor leaned into his touch. "I played for you, Dad. The whole time I was playing for you. All those nights you worked extra shifts so I could have piano books. All those times you sat and listened to me practice the same piece over and over. All the sacrifices you made. I put all of that into my music." "I never saw them as sacrifices," Thomas said. "Not when it came to you and your gift." "And now everything's going to be different," Eleanor said. "You won't have to worry about rent or bills. You'll have proper medical care. The school has connections with the university hospital, and I'll be able to focus on music without having to work 3 jobs. Can you imagine?" Thomas closed his eyes for a moment as if trying to picture this new reality. When he opened them again, they shone with pride. "Tell me everything," he said. "Don't leave out a single detail." Eleanor settled more comfortably on the floor beside his chair and began to recount the day, the waiting room, the whispers and judgmental looks, her moment of frozen panic at the piano, and then the transformation that had occurred when she began to play. She described the standing ovation, the tears in the audience, the judges' reactions, and the offer that had followed. "They thought I was nothing when I walked in," she said. "Just a plain girl in a simple dress who didn't belong there. But when I played, Dad, it was like they finally saw me." "The real me," Thomas nodded. "That's the power of your music, Ellie. It reveals truth, yours and everyone else's." As she finished her story, Eleanor realized her father was struggling to stay awake, the excitement and emotion of the conversation having drained his limited energy. She helped him from the chair to his bed in the small room off the living area, adjusting his oxygen tube and making sure he was comfortable. "We should celebrate," he murmured as she pulled the blanket up around him. "Maybe order from that Chinese place you like." Eleanor smiled. "Tomorrow," she promised. "We'll celebrate properly tomorrow. Right now you need to rest." As Thomas drifted off to sleep, Eleanor returned to the living room and sat at their old upright piano. She placed her fingers on the keys but didn't press down, not wanting to disturb her father's rest. Instead, she simply felt the cool ivory beneath her fingertips and imagined the music. Her thoughts drifted to what lay ahead, studying at one of the finest music schools in the country, learning from masters of their craft, developing her unique voice without the constant pressure of financial worry. For the first time in her life, doors that had seemed permanently closed to someone like her had swung open. But more than the opportunity itself, what filled Eleanor's heart was the knowledge that her father would be with her to see it happen. He would sit in the audience at her first student recital. He would meet her new teachers and friends. He would have the care he needed in a comfortable home where she could still look after him. The weight of years of fear, that she might lose him, that they might be separated, that she would have to choose between her music and her family, lifted from her shoulders. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Ms. Reed and the other teachers from Westfield Music School organized a small farewell concert where Eleanor played her award-winning piece for the community that had supported her. The local newspaper ran a story about her scholarship, complete with a photo of Eleanor and her father in front of their apartment building. Former students brought cards and small gifts to wish her well. Even the landlord, who had often been stern about late rent payments, shook her hand and gruffly said he'd always known she was going places. The day of the move arrived bright and clear. A van provided by Willowbrook waited outside their building. 2 student volunteers helped carry the few possessions Eleanor and her father wanted to take. Their clothes, some books, family photos, and of course, the upright piano that had been Eleanor's faithful companion through so many late nights and early mornings. "Are you sure we can bring it?" Eleanor had asked Maestro Harrington during one of their planning calls. "I know the apartment probably has a better one, but this piano is special to us. My dear Miss Bennet," the maestro had replied, his voice warmer than she would have believed possible based on their first meeting. "That piano is part of your musical journey. Of course it comes with you." As the last box was loaded into the van, Eleanor and her father took a final look around the empty apartment. So many memories lived within these walls, hard times and good times, struggles and small victories, tears and laughter. "Ready, Dad?" Eleanor asked, offering her arm for support. Thomas nodded, leaning on her slightly as they walked slowly toward the door. "More than ready," he said. "It's time for your next chapter." They made their way carefully down the stairs and out to the waiting van. Several neighbors had gathered to see them off, including Mrs. Patel, who pressed a container of homemade sweets into Eleanor's hands with whispered good wishes. As they settled into the van, Eleanor watched her father gaze out the window at the neighborhood where they had lived for most of her life. She wondered if he felt any sadness at leaving. "Dad?" she said softly. "Are you okay?" Thomas turned to look at her, a peaceful smile on his face. "I'm more than okay, Ellie. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, with you, heading toward your future." The van pulled away from the curb. As they drove through the city toward their new home, Eleanor thought about the journey that had brought them here. Not just the physical journey from their old apartment to Willowbrook, but the longer, harder road they had traveled together through years of struggle and sacrifice. She thought about the piano audition that had changed everything, about the moment when people who had judged her by her appearance had been forced to truly see her through her music. She thought about how a single opportunity, given at the right moment, could alter the course of a life, but mostly, she thought about the next piece she would write, a composition about new beginnings, about doors opening, about the joy of being recognized for who you truly are, rather than what others see on the surface. As the van turned onto the tree-lined drive leading to Willowbrook Conservatory, Eleanor reached for her father's hand. Together they watched the grand building come into view, its windows catching the sunlight, its doors open and waiting. "We're home, Dad," Eleanor said softly. Thomas squeezed her hand. "We always have been, Ellie," he replied. "Home isn't a place. It's where your music lives, right here." He placed their joined hands over her heart. "And now the whole world gets to hear it."